I messed up. He was trying to surprise me, but instead caught me with AP.
My husband decided to surprise me at work. His smile faded when he saw me with my coworker. This is an account of regret and how an agreement to a dinner ruined one of the most positive and beautiful fragments of my life, forcing me to relinquish my love life. It's hard to tell as I do not have an idea of where to begin, but I will do my best to give a summary of the narrative so as to best understand how I ruined my life by getting used to a mistake. Hi, Redditors. I am Michaela Webb, and I am 32 years of age. I am a law graduate from one of the most prestigious universities in the state. I am also an introvert as I enjoy the comfort of my apartment, my personal space, while I enjoy doing the things I love doing the most, which involves reading novels, watching my favorite telenovelas, and some other hobbies. I do hold my career in high esteem because I was a business attorney at a law firm a couple of minutes from where I stay, my apartment. Although I lost this job a few years back as a result of an unfortunate incident, because I had an association with someone who was being investigated for money laundering, and this cost me my job. Maybe I was a bit unlucky, but at the same time, if not for that incident, I wouldn't have met my husband, Calvin, who I got associated with a few months after the incident, and we tied the knot a couple of months after. I met Calvin when I was 28. He is 2 years older than I am, and he was 30 at the time. I had just lost my job at the law firm almost 6 months before, and then the event of our first meeting came to be as I was invited by a friend to tag along to a double date with her partner, who had brought his friend, which happened to be Calvin. He was a land surveyor who happened to own a real estate agency. Calvin and I met on this day. There was a lovely interaction between the two of us when my friend was having conversations with her partner. Meeting Calvin made me feel this was the missing part of my life, and I was already willing to be with him because I was a single lady who had been alone for quite a while. One could have said I was being pushed by loneliness, but I guess he felt what I was feeling that day. It was the best date I had ever experienced. From his words, one could tell he was an intelligent and honest being whose intentions were pure and real. We exchanged contacts, deciding the friendship should be a continuous one. It was love at first sight for the two of us. Not long after the double date and a couple of online texts and conversations, we decided to fix a lunch date at a restaurant owned by one of his friends, unknowingly to me. And that was our very second meeting, which was followed up by a couple of outings and picnics that went on for a while. At this time, I guess we were already aware of our feelings, and it was becoming more or less like a relationship between the two of us. One day, he invited me to his office where we had discussions, and he got to know the history behind my unemployment. Through this, he suggested he introduced me to someone who he knew, and this happened to be the managing director of a bank who goes by the name Charles. They both went to school together and had been friends for quite a while. I was invited for an interview in which the managing director, Charles, was impressed with my qualifications and my responses to his question. I guess my answers interested him, or maybe it was especially since he was friends with Calvin. He hired me. I was offered a position as a manager at one of the bank's branches in the state, and I have been working at this place ever since, making it about 3 to 4 years of work so far at the bank, and so many things happened and went downhill. I'll talk about the first day I started. I wore one of my finest corporate dresses to work. I was dressed in a blue skirt and jacket with white shirt. It was one of my most expensive dresses. Work, according to Charles, resumed at 8 o'clock in the morning and ended by 6 o'clock in the evening. On this day, I made sure I was as early as possible. I got to work 30 minutes after 7 in the morning. On getting to the workplace, I met the receptionist who was just settling down at work. I was directed to wait at the visitors' lounge, which was a section of the reception more like a waiting area, but this was dedicated to the visitors of the managing director. It was an isolated space in the hall, and I had to wait for approximately an hour and 45 minutes. I was getting tired, but I didn't make any complaints because I knew this was a big change for me. The receptionist came to apologize and informed me that the managing director was around. I was then directed to the Charles office by the receptionist. I knocked, and a voice told me to come in. We exchanged pleasantries, and then Charles introduced me to his colleague, and I realized he was going to be a coworker of mine. He was told to take me around the premises, introduce me to the basics and details of the job. He was also to take me through my job order at the office and at the same time introduce me to other staff at work. So basically all he was to do is to take me on a tour around the premises so as to get familiar with the work environment. He told me his name was Maurice, and Charles, informed him that I was going to be working with them from that day as a co-manager, in order to reduce his workload and ease him off stress. I put two and two together and realized Maurice also had a high position at the bank. I left Charles's office and Maurice smiled at me. He told me it was a pleasure having me here. I was glad and happy as he seemed like the gentle man he was. He took me around the premises, showed me the most important spaces and rooms for me to know, starting from the counter to the customer service room and then the restrooms and so on. After this, a meeting was held with the other staff where I was introduced as a manager to my colleagues, and they all welcomed me in a warm fashion. Immediately after the meeting was concluded, I was taken to my new office where my job nature was explained to me vividly for me to understand. Maurice also said if I had any unclarity and questions, I shouldn't hesitate to come to him as he smiled and left the office. The day went by with me having to do too little and so little of work on my first day. After the close of the day at work, which was 6 o'clock, I left the office and returned home. Maurice Walsh was a tall, fine young man with a cute smile, well-dressed, and he smelled nice. Apparently, he was a graduate of financial technology and happened to be a product of the same school as I. He was a year older than I am. On the day of my first encounter with Maurice, which happens to be my first day at work, I was 29 years of age and he was 30 years of age. On my second day at work, I arrived a few minutes to 8 in the morning, about 10 to 5 minutes or so, where I happened to meet my Maurice after driving in and parking my vehicle at the workplace garage. He was just getting off his vehicle too, and we exchanged greetings and decided to work in the office together. During this process, we discussed and talked about our background. I told him about my school days and study in which he did the same, and to our surprise, we both finished from the same school and graduated in the same year. This brought us closer as I felt like I now have someone to communicate with better at work. We exchanged contacts and we walked into the office and both separated, headed into our offices to tackle the day at work. It was almost lunchtime at work. Lunch started at 1 in the afternoon and ended at 2. It was an hour break. My phone rang at about 15 minutes to lunch break and I picked it up. It was Maurice, but then I thought he was about to discuss work only for him to invite me for lunch, to my surprise. I asked what was going on, then he explained it was a welcome gesture from him, and included that he has a favorite spot a few blocks from work where he spends his lunch break getting filled with delicious fast foods and snacks, which he was inviting me to tag along. I told him no problem, and I decided to join up with him, having a lunch partner. I thought, it wouldn't hurt, would it? It was time and we both left work together. We took a stroll to the snack bar and we talked along the way. It was a really nice spot because the environment was conducive and really comfortable and the food was top-notch. While we were eating, we discussed more about ourselves, talking about our interests and hobbies. We also talked about our dislikes, and I was interested in talking to him more often, and that was how lunch with Maurice became a thing every day at work. And apparently, I found a close and harmless friend in which I could confide in. After the meal, it was 2 o'clock in the afternoon already, and it was the end of break. We both returned left to work together, heading to our separate offices at work. Work ended at 6, and we said before we headed home. At this point, Calvin and I were not married, but we were actually dating. He was also aware of my friendship with Maurice. Then how did the marriage come to be? It was a beautiful weekend, probably 4 or 5 months after I started work and I was free for the week. Calvin and I went on a picnic together at a park. We were both dining and eating while making jokes and having fun. The typical playing games with someone you're in love with. I was pressed and I had to use the restroom. I told Calvin about this and I was like, I'll be back. It was almost as if he had been waiting for this chance. His chance. When I got back, we continued with our games until I discovered a wrapped box like a present. It wasn't there before I left, and then he said he just had it delivered and that he had been expecting since before I left. He also said it was a present for me and then handed it over to me to unbox. I looked at the shape and it looked like a jewelry box. I was right, of course. I was excited to open it in order to see what sort of necklace he got for me. To my surprise, I found a ring instead. I was even more shocked when he knelt down in public with a proposal for marriage as I opened the box. It was one of the happiest days of my life because I had been expecting his proposal for so long since our first meeting at the double date. Without wasting time, I told him yes in a hurry in case he decided to change his mind or call it a prank. He smiled and then inserted the ring into my finger. He hugged me and gave me a long kiss I would never forget. It didn't take us up to a month, and we were fully wedded as husband and wife because I wanted to be his wife so soon. We started living together and I moved my properties into his own department. I became Calvin's wife at the age of 29 and he was 31. That was a year and a few months after our first meetup. 2 years had passed and I was 31 by then. An unfortunate incident happened, and this was the beginning of the series of misfortunes that befell my love life. On this fateful day, I got a call from an unknown number. Apparently, it was a worker at my husband's agency. I was called and notified that Calvin had collapsed at work. I rushed off work because the news was unbearable and I couldn't handle it. On my way out, I decided to notify Maurice of what had happened and how I received the call of my husband's well-being. He suggested he follow me and drive me to the hospital because I was not in a stable mental condition to drive. I agreed and he came with me to the hospital. When we got to the hospital, I was directed by the receptionist nurse to my husband's admission room to check up on him. Maurice, on the other hand, was directed to stay in the waiting area. I arrived at the room and saw Calvin laying on the bed sleeping with drips being passed into his body system. This got me into tears as I never had it in mind or expected any of this. I headed to the doctor's office after seeing my husband, where I met the doctor in charge of his health. He sat me down and then discussed with me the current condition of my husband. He said a diagnosis had been done on him and the result of the test would be out the following day. I excused myself, and I returned to the reception where I told Maurice I'll be staying with Calvin for a while before returning home, meaning that I wouldn't be returning to work that day. He left, and I stayed with Calvin at the hospital till it was around 7 in the evening that day. I was worried and sad as a result of his health condition, so I hurried home to see if I could get any clothes or anything we would need in the hospital. It was the second day, and I headed for the hospital after making a call the previous evening to get an excuse at work from Charles, who was already aware of the situation. He stated that there was no issue and it was important. I arrived at the hospital as early as 8 o'clock in the morning, and I headed directly to my husband's room, where I met the doctor and a nurse doing a morning checkup on him. After this was done, the doctor invited me to his office to discuss the result of the test carried out the previous day on him. The doctor stated that the result of the tests carried out on him gave a conclusion that he was having a critical kidney infection alongside with blood infection, and this was the reason for his sudden collapse, as he has been affected by this for a while without treatment, and this resulted in him being at the hospital. I don't know how it started. I started thinking so many things like, what if Charles knew but didn't tell me? The doctor went further and stated that the hospital will do their best to make sure he receives the best treatment possible in order for him to get discharged and return home as soon as possible. Injections and drugs were prescribed for him, and I headed back to his room where he was already awake. He said he also didn't know about him, and I comforted him and at the same time offered him light cereal to eat while I stayed with him all day. A week after, I resumed work, even though Calvin was still being hospitalized. Calvin insisted that he would be fine and I shouldn't leave work for so long. It was the 3rd week of my husband's sickness on a Wednesday. Maurice and I went on a lunch break to our usual spot, and then he asked about my husband's welfare. He was the only comforter I had then. I opened up to him about the pressure, the worry, and the emotional loneliness I was going through at the moment. It was at that point he suggested we go out for dinner at a popular bar around the premises, so as to relieve myself of the stress I was going through as at that moment. I humbly turned down his request, telling him I was going to be with my husband that night, and it was an important period for me to be with him at the hospital, comforting him. The lunch ended that day, and then everyone went to the office as usual that day, until 2 days after which the pressure started getting to me. I called him that evening asking if he was still available for dinner. The pressure and emotional downness was getting to me, and I needed someone to be with that night so as to give me comfort. Unknowingly, that was going to be the biggest mistake of my love life. I met Maurice that night at the restaurant he picked where we had our dinner, drank a couple of liquor, and talked for a while. We were both drunk, but he suggested driving me home because I was too drunk to drive home. On the trip back home, he told me a lot of things. It could be because he was drunk, but he was serious. Emotions started spilling, and he started to talk about how he was into me until he discovered I was getting married and it was too late for him to ask me out properly. I also told him it could have been him I had married if I hadn't met Calvin early. I know I shouldn't have said that. I guess both of us were under the influence of alcohol. Once I got home, he escorted me to my front door, but I tripped. He had to carry me up to the room where our matrimonial bed is located. One thing led to another, and then we slept off. I woke up the next day naked with a naked man beside me. I was still having a hangover from the previous night, and I realized what I had done. It was my first affair with Morris, a mistake that would not have happened if I had not agreed and called for the dinner. I was shocked, and I tapped him awake. He woke up in confusion too. The feelings were there truly, but the affair was a mistake to both of us. I guess through the process of the intercourse, at some point I might have thought it was Calvin, and it happened in my room, on my matrimonial bed. He dressed up and headed out as quickly as possible out of the house, although it was a mistake. I felt like it was the best sex I had ever had because my body was still in the urge to have more of it. Few weeks passed, and it was 3 months since my husband's sickness started, and he had already been discharged from the hospital. He resumed work the week before that, and at this point Maurice and I had yet to discuss what had happened between us. There was no closure even though we met at work, and, of course, the regular lunch break meetings we had stopped. To be honest, I wanted the affair to continue, not at the jeopardy of my marriage. I wanted both men to myself if possible, and on this day I invited Maurice to my office for closure and a brief discussion of what had happened, but my actual plan was to seduce him into wanting the affair to continue. I didn't know what was happening to me. He sat down in front of my desk, and I asked him why he had been so distant from me. He stated it was because of the mistake that had happened between us. He didn't want it to mess up my marriage and love life. I stood up from my seat and moved closer to him. I sat on his legs, and I urged him not to call it a mistake. I pressed myself on him, and he was trying to resist placing his hand into my shirt. I kissed him, and he responded. The door opened without a knock. It was my husband who had entered. He looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, and I immediately felt regret. He said his intention was to surprise me with a visit and to take me out on a romantic dinner since it was the eve before our anniversary of our first meeting at the double date. He said his interest was to make it a special night for me, only to find me in such a compromising position with my coworker. It was an unlucky event, and I kept looking at his face. I tried apologizing, but he didn't listen. I tried to rearrange myself from the shock I was experiencing too. His visit was so highly unexpected, only for him to see me with Maurice like this. Calvin left the office without listening to my pleas, and Maurice also left. I understood because this was all my fault. Update. I got back home that night, and there was a lot of argument between Calvin and I. He was confused about when the affair started. I tried apologizing at the same time, explaining to him what actually happened, how my weakness and the pressure of his illness got me to do what I did. This was not convincing enough to him, not like I should ever have an excuse for cheating on him. I really messed up. He said he was never going to forgive me for the incident and stated clearly that was the beginning of the end of our marriage. And then I had to sleep in the living room that night on the couch. The following morning, he told me to move out of his house with my loads and luggage, and I had no choice. I went to my friend's apartment where I have been staying for a while now. Also, the incident cost me my job. My silly mistake practically cost me my relationship, home and job at the same time as a friend, Maurice. I tried talking to Maurice, but he also said he wasn't going to forgive me for making him lose his job, something I didn't know happened. I apologized, but he blocked my contact and made it clear he never wants to see me again. Some days had passed, and the divorce papers were delivered to me. We had to go through the divorce officially, with me having no way of defending myself through the divorce. I guess I was the architect of my own misfortune, and this taught me so much. It made me understand that a mistake is a mistake regardless of how interesting it was. It also made me understand not to get too close with another man, especially when I have a good relationship and love life going on. And this is the story of how I ended up being a single, homeless, and jobless lady at the age of 32. And it was all my fault. Need advice? Our divorce lawyer is someone I have a past with. Now I'm in big trouble. Hey guys, it's my first time here on Reddit, and I'm here because I want to share a story with everyone. I also need help, so if you would please read this, I thank you, and I'll want your advice at the end of it. My name is Valerie, and I am 29 years old. I had an affair with my divorce lawyer. I know it's crazy to believe, but every time I think about it, I tell myself it's real. I am soon to be divorced, and my husband and I had planned to fix our relationship. Now, I know we can no longer fix it anymore. My husband's name is Greg, and he's 32 years old. I met Greg when I was in high school, and I was 17 years old then. I don't know why, but we hit it off immediately once we met. Greg was a caring guy, and I didn't see any flaws in him because he felt perfect to me. We dated throughout high school, but his family weren't doing okay financially. He tried getting jobs, but that didn't help much either. I told him I can help since I came from an above-average family and we were okay financially. He told me he didn't want help from his girlfriend, but he was really grateful. By the time we finished high school, I remember Greg was no longer cheerful since he was worrying about what to do next and how to help his family. I kept asking him why he didn't want my help, and he told me he wasn't comfortable. He said he was the one that's supposed to take care of me, not the other way round. I tried telling him I didn't care about the money issue, but I guess it was just a man thing. At one point, I couldn't meet up with him again, and we didn't see each other most of the time. I hated the fact that his pride was trying to come in between our relationship. I talked to him about it again, and he told me an uncle of his who was overseas called him to come work for me. I wanted to beg him to stay, but I knew that would be extremely selfish of me. He gave me one last kiss and told me to wait for him. He also said he'd understand if I wanted to find someone else, and he didn't want to tie me down. I told him I was going to wait for him no matter what it took. Greg also said he would be keeping in contact with me. 3 years passed, and I was 20 years old by then. Greg had been keeping in contact with me as promised. Throughout the years that we were far apart, he kept informing me about how things were going for him. He told me about the work. I can't disclose it here, sorry. But it was bringing a lot of money for his family. I was happy to hear, even though I wasn't happy about the job. I told Greg I missed him, and he said he missed me too. I asked Greg about when he planned on coming back, and he told me very soon. I loved Greg with all my heart, but my feelings kept fluctuating because he was far away. There was a time I dated a guy during the 3 years that had passed to fill that numb feeling I had, and I had slept with the guy then. I felt guilty, and it felt like I was cheating on Greg. I didn't tell Greg about it because I tried to keep the memory at the back of my mind. I didn't know that the memory would come back to haunt me. Another year passed, and I turned 21. By then, I had already moved out of my parents' house and rented my own place with the help of my parents. I didn't want to depend on my parents forever, so I decided to find a job. I didn't go to college because I didn't see the use. I was able to get a job as a teacher in a school through the connection of my parents. I think the other teachers in the school didn't like me because of that, but it wasn't like I cared. The pay was okay, and I told Greg all about my own place and everything that had happened. Greg asked me where I stayed in the US, and I told him. I thought he was just asking for no reason, but one day, I heard the doorbell ring. I opened the door, and it was Greg standing on my front doorstep. I was shocked to see him there, and my emotions were all tangled up. I didn't know what to feel, and all I knew was that my love for him had reduced. I thought it was maybe because it had been 4 years since I'd met him, and the love would rekindle for him. I had to pretend like I still loved him, and I jumped on him, hugging him tight. We caught up on a lot of things, and he told me more things. He told me that he was going to open his business firm. I won't be disclosing the name. He bought an apartment for the two of us to live in. He also said that he would open a boutique for me, and I was happy about that. Along the way, everything followed as planned, and it was okay for us. Yet, I didn't feel that full love for him. By the time I turned 23, we went on one of our dates that day to celebrate my birthday. I was shocked when he got down on one knee and proposed. I was going to say no because I wasn't sure or ready, but he looked so happy, and I didn't want to break his heart by telling him no. I know what everyone's thinking, and I know what I did was wrong, but I can't go back to the past to change that. We got married by the time I was 24, and he made it a big wedding. He invited all our family members and friends. I didn't want a big party, but he was so excited throughout as we were planning it. We got married, and everything worked out well. I gave birth to a baby boy, and we named him after his grandfather, Jonah. Our family came around, and we celebrated. My boutique business was booming, and I had a lot of customers. I think things started to change when he stopped coming home early. He told me his job was getting stressful and taking most of his time. I complained to him about it, but Greg kept saying I should give him more time and he'd make it up to me. My love for him kept fading, and I could see the distance set in. Jonah was growing old, and he turned 2 years, and I was 27 years then. The only time Jonah could see Greg was on weekends, and I hated that. I tried complaining, but he asked for more time. Eventually, he became free, but that didn't make my feelings for him better. He usually told me, "I love you," but it has been long since I heard those words from him. I knew he was also feeling that distance and losing his feelings for me. Jonah is 4 years old now, and he's very smart. It pained me to see him walking around not knowing he had parents who didn't love each other that much. I stopped going to my boutique at one point because I got some workers to help me out there. I talked to Greg and told him we had to get a divorce because I couldn't force myself to love him. I asked him if he was feeling the same way, and he said he was. He wanted us to fix it, and he tried, but it was to no avail and the feelings didn't rekindle. Yet he kept on trying. One day he told me we were going to get a divorce, and I won't lie, but I felt a little bit happy. I was away from the loveless marriage, which was my fault in the same place. Greg told me that he was going to get a divorce lawyer, and he was true with his words. But I regret thinking this. The next day came, and it was 10 a.m. in the morning when the doorbell rang and I went to answer it. The shock on my face was wide because I was surprised to see the person in front. It was the man I had something with during the past. He was the one I didn't tell Greg about. I told him to come in, and I tried to compose myself to act like I didn't know him. What bothered me was the way my heart started beating fast, but not from fear, but excitement. I didn't know what to feel, but it was the same as the first time I met Greg. The divorce lawyer introduced himself as Lucas, and my husband shook his hand. I knew his name, but I acted like I didn't know him. I couldn't have the strength to tell my husband about it, and I hope Lucas said nothing about it. He sat down, and he said nothing for a few seconds. My husband stood up to receive a call before anything started, and Lucas and I stared at ourselves. I didn't know what to say to him, and I'm pretty sure he didn't know either. I was about to say something to him, but my husband came back. The meeting started, and I watched as Lucas and Greg discussed a lot of things. Greg told him about the whole relationship issue we had, and that we wanted a divorce because we were falling out of love, and I felt guilty. We decided on the things I would be getting after the divorce would be finalized, and how we would fix child custody on Jonah. Lucas said he understood, and he needed 2 days to put together documents and review them before he was back. Throughout the conversation, I felt his eyes stealing glances at me. Lucas gave Greg his number, and he gave me too. The whole thing was weird because I didn't have his number anymore since I deleted it long ago. We thanked him, and he left. After that happened, I received a weird text that night with just a "hey," and I already knew who it was. I texted him back, and that was how I started talking to him. That night, he said he had a lot of questions to ask me, and he would love to meet up with me the next day. I was hesitant at first, but I couldn't turn him down since I was the one that cut contact with him with no explanations, and he saw me a year later, married to someone. I agreed to meet him, and I was still contemplating whether I should tell my husband the truth, but I wasn't ready. Before I went to sleep, my husband told me again that he really wanted to make us work, and he was sorry for everything he did and how he had been acting. I also apologized to him, but just at random, not for a particular thing. I couldn't tell him that I was the one that began to fall out of love in the first place ever since he traveled then. The next day arrived faster than I had expected, and I already hated the day. Greg pecked me on my cheeks before leaving, and I smiled at him. I had to drop Jonah off at the school before I went to the bathroom to clean up and get ready to meet with Lucas. The problem was that I knew I wanted to dress up for him, and I felt silly about that. I put on my casual clothes and a light makeup. I felt crazy because why was I putting on makeup to meet up with an ex? Anyways, I had contacted him, and he told me to meet up with him at a restaurant. I went there, and once I spotted him, he waved at him. I wore my glasses because I hoped none of my husband's friends would recognize me. We were both speechless after I sat down, and I wished he would say something first to break the silence. My wish came through, and he started by asking him why I broke it off then and everything we had. I told him the truth about Greg and the whole story about us, and he listened. By the time I was done, he sighed and he said he understood everything. He said he was upset with me and he felt happy to see me, and I smiled at him. The next thing he said after was shocking. He told me he still wanted something with me, but I just frowned. He did know I was married, but even though I was going through a divorce, I couldn't believe he was going to say something like that. Although a part of me actually wanted to be with him and let him feel me, and I was ashamed of that thought. I knew I was supposed to feel annoyed by what he said, but the thing that annoyed me was that I didn't. I didn't say anything, and I got lost in thoughts. not until he called my name to snap me out of it. He apologized for saying something so absurd, but I brushed it off and told him it was okay. Lucas asked me if my husband knew about us and what we had in the past, but I told him I couldn't tell him, so he just nodded in an understanding manner. He asked me if we could be just friends because he missed what we had and the way we vibed with each other. I didn't think he had any second thoughts about it, but I should have known better. I didn't even think before I said yes to us being friends again. I went home that day with a smile on my face, not knowing that things were going to take a turn for the worse. Lucas came over the next day and we still acted like we didn't know ourselves before now. He brought some documents he had printed out and compiled based on the division of the assets. I didn't see the use in getting anything from Greg, but Greg insisted. He was going to leave me with the house and the boutique was in my name, so it didn't matter. I also read through some documents and it mentioned that Greg wanted to leave me with a huge amount of cash. I protested, saying I didn't need something like that, but I felt like it was an excuse to just see Lucas again. Lucas said he would come over again in some days with the finalized papers which Greg and I will have to sign. I was sad but happy at the same time, and I don't know if that makes sense. Lucas kept contacting me at night and we texted talking about random things. I had taken Jonah to school that day and got back home. I was bored and didn't know what to do. It was like Lucas read my mind from anywhere he was, and I heard the doorbell ring. I opened the door to see Lucas standing in my front with his usual suit and the bag he carried. I wasn't expecting him, so it was awkward. He explained that he called Greg and informed him that he was coming, but Greg said he was at work, but he should show me the documents so I could agree on them. I told Lucas to come in and he sat down. I could feel his scent lingering in the air when it passed, and it made me feel some kind of way. He asked when Greg would be back, but I didn't think he had a motive, so I told him in the evening and we started talking about the documents. He told me to come sit beside him to look at the documents clearer, and it was dumb, I know. I listened to him, and I felt his hands brush past my thighs. He leaned in for a kiss, and I accepted it. It felt different than Greg's own. I don't know how it happened, but we were both on the bed, staring at the ceiling with the sheets over us. The guilt came back to me, and it was due to the fact that I had just slept with my ex, who was also our divorce lawyer. I knew it also meant that I just cheated on my husband because the divorce had not been finalized. Lucas turned his head to face me and smiled at me. He asked me if I didn't enjoy what we just did, and I lied to him that I didn't. It was one of the best things I'd ever felt before. He asked me if I didn't miss this because he knew I was lying. I told him to leave because I couldn't take it anymore. I had mixed feelings, but with what happened, a part of me knew I wanted to be with Greg, and I told Lucas that. I told him we should forget what had happened between us in the past and right now. I also told Lucas that if my marriage didn't work out, I wanted to get divorced happily and not have anything to do with him. Me sleeping with him made me sure that I felt nothing for him. I don't know what triggered him, but he got up and started dressing up. It was clear that he was angry at me, but I didn't do what I said wrong. He told me he wished I had changed my mind and that I was going to regret not changing my mind. He packed his things and told me he was going to come back and he would inform Greg. I didn't know what to say, and I kept quiet. The remaining days went smoothly, and I noticed that Greg was changing. He was trying to be there when I needed it, and we were discussing our feelings more. I was beginning to change my mind on the divorce because I wanted to make this marriage work. The guilt of sleeping with Lucas was still there, and I tried pushing it to the back of my mind. Greg and I didn't bother contacting Lucas again for him to come with any papers. 1 week had passed since I had an affair with Lucas. Greg and I were enjoying our time together in the living room. He had taken time off from work to spend it with me. The doorbell rang and he went to check who it was. It took some time for him to get back, so I went to check on him. I saw Lucas standing at the door with a strong look on his face. I don't know what he told Greg, but Greg told him to come in and sit down. He also told me to sit. Greg told Lucas that he was planning on canceling the divorce, but with what he heard from him, he wanted to confirm it from me, or divorce was going to happen as soon as possible. I was scared because I knew something had happened at the door, and I'll never know what it was. Greg asked me if it was true that I'd slept with Lucas. I denied it at first because there was no proof and it was just claims. Everything changed when Lucas played a voice record and I heard my voice. It was when I had just slept with him and the conversation we had. I know I messed up big time. I tried denying, but there was no use, so I told him it was true. I also said it was during our divorce, but I know I still cheated on him. I tried apologizing, but he didn't listen. I looked at Lucas angrily, but he had a tiny smirk on his face. He was happy about all this happening, and I felt like hitting his face. I knew it wasn't his fault, but mine. Lucas said he was going to leave and told Greg to contact him about the divorce if he wanted to change anything. Greg just sat looking at me dumbstruck. I think he was thinking about everything that happened because he had a sad look on his face. I told him I still wanted him, and what happened was a silly mistake, but he didn't listen. I also told him about my past with Lucas and how I'd slept with him when Greg was overseas. That made him more infuriated and he left the house. It happened 2 days ago and I wasn't able to contact him because I think he blocked me. I'm all alone with Jonah in the house, but I'm worried that I'll lose Jonah since Lucas and Greg were plotting something regarding the divorce. I don't know what to do because it feels like I'll lose everything. How do I make things better? Please help me. ***. Comments. ***1. ***u/Reddit user. 1. ***. Okay, you messed up big time, Valerie. What were you thinking? The moment things went wrong was when you didn't tell Greg about Lucas, and then you even agreed to meet up with him. Also, what kind of wife agrees to be friends with her? You knew what it was going to come to. You should give up because I don't think he will take you back. 2. ***u/Reddit user 2. ***u/Reddit user 1. Can you stop bashing the poor lady? She made silly mistakes and she came here for advice. Valerie, your marriage sounds great even if you were unsure of the love you had for Greg. You still tried to make it work when you felt nothing, and I feel like that's a good thing you did. If Greg ends the marriage, you should find someone else who deserves you. Don't cry over spilled milk. 3. ***u/Reddit user 3. When you mean you're worried you'll lose everything, do you mean the house and the boutique? I thought you were rich, so you shouldn't worry about that, haha. If you do want to fix things, you should apologize to him once he gets home, and maybe his family members if they'll listen to you. But if not, there's nothing you can do. Update. Okay, well, a lot of things have happened since I made that post. Greg came back 2 days after with Lucas. I was scared, but I listened to the advice I read in the comments. I apologized to Greg so many times, but he still didn't listen. Lucas showed me the divorce papers and I was shocked. I wasn't going to get any money or even the house. It also wrote that he'll be taking custody of Jonah, but I argued on that. I can't lose everything. In one day, so he agreed. I protested about lots of things on the divorce paper, but I knew I deserved it. I signed the paper because Greg said he didn't want to see my face anymore and I should leave quickly. I went to my parents' house and told them all that happened. They said they were ashamed of me and that hurt to hear. I also contacted Greg's family, but they said they don't want to talk to me. I left Jonah with Greg because he said he deserved to see him more than I did, and I know he was right. I don't deserve anything. He left me with the boutique because it was already on my name, but I think Greg paid them to leave because they all quit some days later and said they couldn't work for me anymore. This happened because I wasn't content with my marriage and I didn't talk about my true feelings with him. If you're married out there and not happy, talk to your husband about it and discuss it. Thank you for the advice and for reading this.